Welcome to this latest edition in our video interview series here at iConnect, the blog of the International Journal of Constitutional Law, co-founded by Tom Ginsburg, joining us today, David Landau, Florida State University, and me, Richard Albert, Texas. Today we have a very special edition of our video interview series. We're gathering a group of scholars to discuss and debate a book, an important book, by Bruce Ackerman, Sterling Professor of Law at Yale University. We're joined by two interlocutors, Tom Ginsburg, who I mentioned a moment ago from the University of Chicago, and Roberto Gargarella, Senior Research Fellow at CONICET in Argentina. Welcome all of you. It's a pleasure to see all of you doing well. I gather you're safe and sound.
We're fine.
You are, wonderful. I want to note that I had invited Menaka Guruswamy to join us. Unfortunately, it was not possible, but Bruce has agreed to join me and Menaka for a three-person conversation on his book sometime in the weeks to come. Thank you for doing that, Bruce. The plan for our discussion is that I'll begin with a short overview of Bruce's book. I'll try to situate it in a larger context, and then we'll have a couple of rounds of comments and critiques, followed by a response by Bruce. We should be online for about 35 to 40 minutes or so. Nearly 25 years ago, Bruce, you uncovered a series of contrasts and convergences among the constitutions of the world, opening our eyes to new possibilities for understanding how the many peoples in our modern day have arrived at their particular form of constitutionalism. Your essay-length study on the rise of world constitutionalism distinguished two patterns in constitutional creation and the attendant roles of courts. You took readers in a global tour of constitutions, both to identify the impulses behind their founding and also to theorize how their beginnings would later compel or constrain future constitutional politics. Public law scholars the world around had long hoped that you, Bruce, would one day expand your essay into a book-length treatment of the fundamental questions you had raised and begun to answer. Well, lucky for us, you've delivered that and much more in your latest book, Revolutionary Constitutions, Charismatic Leadership and the Rule of Law, published by Harvard University Press, the first installment in what will be a multi-volume study on the foundations of constitutionalism. Your new book, Bruce, forces us to rethink many subjects in public law, from populism to democratic retrogression, from constitutional design to constitutional amendment, and from the role of courts in democracy to the promise and peril of popular constitution making. And so with this book, Bruce, once again, you find yourself at the center of the essential constitutional questions of our time. Is the US Constitution exceptional in the world? What are the historical origins of the popular movements that have achieved great successes in rights and freedoms, the same rights and freedoms that are now under pressure seemingly in every corner of the globe? What threats do charismatic leaders pose to the rule of law? And what institutional design choices can they make to reinforce its values? To answer these and other questions, Bruce, you serve as our guide across East and West. In your book, you take us to France, India, South Africa, Iran, Italy, Israel, the US, along with Burma and Poland, countries in the midst of dramatic constitutional transformations. And you find an as yet unidentified thread that runs through the constitutions of each of these countries. They are, you say, revolutionary constitutions. And Bruce, you define these constitutions as revolutionary in contrast to two other types of constitutions, establishmentarian and elite constructions. What distinguishes these three constitutional archetypes is the path that each takes to constitutionalism and the competing sources of authority and legitimation that sustain their local constitutional orders. Let me say just a word about each of the two other paths that were not the focus of your book. For you, Bruce, Great Britain is a paradigmatic example, you say, of the establishmentarian tradition. In this tradition, pragmatic incumbents, locked in battle with challengers, make strategic concessions that split the outsiders into moderate and radical camps. The incumbents then invite the moderate outsiders to desert their radical brethren and join the political establishment in governing the country. What results are landmark statutes that formalize some reforms, yet maintain continuity in the establishment. Countries in this tradition, you say, Bruce, include Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and certain countries in Asia, Scandinavia, and Latin America. Now, the category of constitutions that you define as elite constructions include the 1949 German Basic Law, the 1947 Japanese Constitution, and the 1978 Spanish Constitution. These and other elite constructions do not arise out of a popular movement. They are instead generated by political elites, both traditional insiders and outsiders, who negotiate a solution to a crisis in the regime. That crisis may be, for instance, a leadership succession in the transition to democracy, as in Spain. It may be a post-war conquest leading to the writing of new rules that restructure the defeated regime, as the world witnessed in Germany and Japan. But this book, Bruce, Revolutionary Constitutions, is focused squarely on the revolutionary model of constitutionalism. The two other models will form the basis of future volumes. In this book, you focus on revolutionary constitutions. What are these constitutions? They're characterized, you say, by a peculiar four-part sequence. A four-part sequence that plays out in these regimes rooted in a tradition of revolutionary constitutionalism. 4 stages. Time 1 is the period of mobilized insurgency. At this stage, outsiders challenge the incumbents in a contest for control, hoping to unseat the dominant actors in a move to bring the country to what they regard as a better tomorrow. Time 2 gives rise to a constitutional founding. The revolutionaries at time 1 have won the day by building popular support, replacing the once dominant actors, and now they usher in a new regime and put their stamp on it by constitutionalizing, you say, their revolutionary charisma. Time 3 presents a succession crisis in the regime. Their charismatic leaders who triumphed at time 2 are exiting center stage as a result of time or circumstance, and this creates a void, a legitimacy vacuum, one might say, that must be filled. But by whom? By descendants of the charismatic leaders, by less charismatic leaders, by autocrats, others. This is the challenge at time 3. And finally, time 4, we arrive at the point of consolidation. Here, it is judges who take the reins to preserve the victories of the revolutionary generation. They do so by identifying, contextualizing, applying the revolutionary principles that had earlier led to the formation of the constitutional bargain at time 2. This 4-stage sequence, Bruce explains, is evident in many jurisdictions around the world, and you walk us through many of these as case studies in your book in exquisite detail. But your thesis, Bruce, of course, is not without its own challengers. Just as you were putting the final touches to your manuscript, we gathered on your home turf at the Yale Law School for a 2-day conference on your book. And this conference offered the first structured opportunity to engage critically with your new project. There are about 20 of us there. Some advanced your thesis, others critiqued it, still others refined it. But I think it's fair to say that all agreed that the ideas in your book will reset the terms of debate on the most important constitutional questions of our time. 2 other conference participants from those many months ago at Yale are here on the line with us, Roberto Gargarella and Tom Ginsburg, and they will offer their views on the book, and you'll have an opportunity to respond. Once again, Roberto Gargarella from Argentina will speak first, followed by Tom Ginsburg. So let me give the floor over to Roberto and then to Tom. But once again, say thank you on behalf of the iConnect family to all of you for participating in this colloquy. Roberto.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm so honored to be here. And we said we only have 5 minutes to make some quick comments. So just a few seconds to say about my admiration of Bruce's work. We learned so much from your work, and you changed our approach to constitutionalism in many, many different aspects. how to conceive the connection between constitutionalism and democracy, how to see the connection between social movements and the law. So you did such a great contribution. So this is a new great contribution, but well, the idea is here to make some comments and critical comments. So allow me to say something. I have 4 or 5 points, very quick. So let me enumerate them and say something. The first is about the 4-stage dynamic that Richard was presenting. So my first question, my paper in the volume is called about the theory of history in your work. So it's basically a question about what's your theory of history. Of course, you may say, I don't have a theory of history, and that's fine. But one needs to understand, I mean, how these stages develop, and also, I mean, what's the status of your claim? Is this a descriptive claim, I guess? Yes, but so then how it develops? Say, I mean, Marx, to take a good contributor, Karl Marx has his own understanding of a theory of history. He said, well, history moves, I mean, following class struggle. Or he said also he had an alternative approach. Well, history has to do with the development of the productive forces. That's another possibility. In my paper, I mentioned some other authors like Barrington Moore also offering an approach to history, so to help us understand how history moves. So he said, well, this has to do with class alliances between farmers and urban population or the peasants, whatever. So one question is whether you have an explanation about how history moves. What keeps this moving in a similar way? Because in a way, it's strange. It's not something that we can take for granted, that history moves in this way, and in all these countries you mentioned and you study, that history developed in this way. So my first question is about that. What's your theory of history? Very connected to this is my second point, which is, I mean, you know, I have been working for a long time with John Elster, and so this is a very Elsterian point. And so the question would be about the micro-foundations, or as he put it, about the nuts and bolts. So what is that explain, what motivates, so I would say, if I had to put a word, is motivation. What is that motivate the actors to go from here to there? It's not clear for me. So you present these stages, but I don't know, it's difficult if you don't present a theory of history, which, of course, I mean, you have only one life, as you say at one point, and you cannot just do everything. But to understand, I mean, why the different actors are going to be motivated to do this or to do that. My intuition is I have problems when I want to accommodate motivation. What's the motivation to create a constitution, protect a constitution, put so much energy in the law? I doubt. But so the second question would be about motivations, if you had something to say about that. The third is also a connected comment, which is what I call in my paper the risk of creating a Procrustean bed. So a Procusto bed is understandable, the notion of the, so is that you present a history, but then given the history is so, I mean, so dispersed, so complex, then you try to adjust it by forcing history into your own schema. That's a risk. And this is a risk that you recognize in page 1 of your book, when you say, I don't want to develop a one-size-fits-all, no? So that's an enormous risk. Just as a footnote, you took, and it's still an undeveloped project, your book on With the People. This appeared, I think, in 1993, and you are still in a way developing the With the People project, which concerns just one country. So, of course, I mean, when you are dealing with so many different countries at the same time, well, there is an enormous risk of creating this Procrustean bed. If we read what you present in your book about your cases, the South African cases, you put as that it includes important variations. France is an exception. Italy is a good case, but if we explain, or if we study, for example, how it developed in time 4, I would say, it's also an anomaly. So that, in a way, shows that the history is so complex that, again, I mean, you know, all my comments go in the same direction. It's very difficult to put all these different histories in one unique theoretical, I mean, structure, category. So I'm calling for variation, for difference, and if not, well, I need to know what explain these similarities, because in principle, I wouldn't explain them. I wouldn't know how to explain that. I mean, it's just a coincidence. It's a pattern in history that moves everything. Fourth point, which is also, is a point that has to do with something you say in this also great book that you wrote, which is at the end of the book, you in a way you criticize yourself, or you are self-critical, and you mention the risk of creating a Washington Center approach or a top-down approach, or to put too much energy in understanding the law and forgetting about you mentioned in page 314, the voices of minorities, women, the poor. And I think that, of course, in this book, it's also clear for me that is too biased toward the law. Of course, we are all lawyers, we are all interested in the law, but the risk is, I mean, of course, that we are going to put our attention in the Constitution, but the risk is attributing too much power to the Constitution and to try to explain through the Constitution more than what we can explain through the Constitution. So, I don't know, we come from different countries, perhaps in a way opposite countries. The United States, I think, has a very strong legalistic culture, and many of the conflicts acquire, in one way or another, the form of the law. That doesn't happen in my country, of course. But maybe that also helps you to have this, I think, bias towards the law, and assuming that too much happens around the discussions around the Constitution. I doubt about that. And also, when I think about those cases, again, South Africa, India, I know, I mean, there are many important judicial decisions in South Africa. We admire all those decisions, the same in India. But I think that the explanatory power of the law in India and in South Africa is very, very small. So again, I'm just skeptical about the energy, the strength, the force you attribute to the law, and particularly to the Constitution. And I'm just closing one or two more comments. One is about, yes, another problem that you detect also in your Civil Rights Revolution book, which is to replace with the people with the judges. Again, I think that I get the impression in this book that there is a lot of energy and explanatory power in what judges do, particularly in time 4. I mean, take your good case, Italy. I mean, this is a good case. And if we study what judges do in Italy, it's basically they have been reproducing what the executive or the political branches wanted. So they have been not doing anything significant in terms of the law. And this is a good case. Again, just to say, perhaps you are putting too much into the Constitution and the influence of the Constitution in shaping our social life. Again, there may be cultures like the United States culture, which is too legalistic, but in other countries, in my country for sure, it's not. But in Italy, in India, and South Africa, I doubt. So that's, and perhaps the final point, which also is with this I finish, is also an Elsterian point. When examining the constitutional conventions, you criticize Elster, saying that the kind of attitude that leaders have in the constitutional convention have very little to do with the, you say, with the mood, with the mindset captured by Elster in Ulysses and the Sirens. So this has nothing to do with rational choice and all these silly things. But I would be more cautious about that, and particularly taking into account the way in which the same John Elster corrected his previous view in a new book, I mean, that came 10 years after Ulysses and the Sirens, which was Ulysses Unbound. And there, I think the main organizing idea in the book was that, I quote, in politics, people never tie their own hands, they only try to bind others. And that, look, that idea, I think, has explanatory power, tell us about motivations, why it explains why actors want to develop in one way or another. So that's interesting in terms of capture some motivation, and I think it goes in the right direction. I mean, not in a nice direction, but in the right direction. So this is what I call in the paper, and with this I finish, the normalization of domination. If constitutional makers and its followers try to bind the life of others, but keep their own hands free, that I understand. I don't like, but I understand that that happens. And that I think is an interesting, I mean, reflection coming from like a book like Ulysses Unbound. So I would recover the force of these kind of ideas, which in a way try to stress the importance of thinking about motivations in order to understand history. And I guess it goes in a direction that is not the same direction where your book is oriented to. But so that's general comments, but I mean, as I said at the beginning, we need so much your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Tom Ginsburg.
Great. Yes, I also want to start by just saying what I think is so magnificent about the book. You know, first of all, just the sheer ambition, it's amazing, you know, to try to have a framework where we can talk about India and Iran and France and ultimately the United Kingdom. And so the ambition is amazing. Also, the way it nicely connects with the earlier themes of Bruce's work, the people, revolution, liberalism, and actually the way, this is my favorite thing about Bruce's work, the way he deals with time, actually. I like what Roberto said about, do you have a theory of history? You at least have a nice framework for us to understand stages, and that's really great. And of course, that goes back to We the People. So I really like that. I also love Max Weber. As I said in my little essay in Richard Albert's edited book, Revolutionary Constitutionalism, you know, I'm a committed Weberian in my private life. But in terms of method, I find it difficult to apply Weber, and particularly the notion of charisma, to the material which we all study, which is comparative constitutional law. And, you know, I think what you're doing, Bruce, you have obviously charisma as a feature of individuals in many of these stories, the Ayatollah Khomeini and Mandela and de Gaulle, and these, you know, fantastic founding figures, and that clearly applies. But you're also applying charisma to the process itself and to almost the unfolding of history, to time, and to collective entities and all kinds of other things, which I think go beyond what Weber thought. And I find it difficult to, in terms of the range of its explanatory power. So I will say, and one way to get at this is you have these cases, and let's just take for a minute that all your cases, we just accept everything about them. My essay is full of quibbles, which we don't have to get into here, about particular facts. Well, you know, we also have some other things going on. We have some revolutionary constitutionalisms which don't involve a charismatic figure. The Philippines, for example, I would put in that category. Stephen Gardbaum in his essay notes Mexico, Tunisia. There's no charismatic there. So there's not actually a charismatic figure. We can, again, apply charisma to this collective process, but that's a bit fuzzy. We do also have many charismatics leading revolutions which aren't constitutionalist. Hugo Chavez, you know, the Castros. And we have a lot of revolutions aren't obviously naturally good things, as you know. And of course, your inclusion of Iran in here is actually quite valuable, I think, because you recognize that. And as we will explore in your other books, I assume, you know, we have lots of legitimated constitutional orders where there's no revolution. So then the question is, what are we really looking at? We're looking at a small subset where this particular path, where we get through all these four stages. Now, how to understand how we get through the four stages? Here's where I just think our methodological difference comes to the fore. I look at these things as packed. I'm very Elsterian, right? And maybe I could just preface this by saying charisma can do post-diction. Jan Elster uses this term. You can do post-diction, but not prediction. It's specifically unpredictable. That's Weber's concept. You never know when it's going to arise and where and when it's going to be effective. And so to understand when it works, when we get through these 4 stages, I think we need more than charisma. We need an understanding of bargains, interests, the assets and liabilities that go on, little things like this vote that you talk about with de Gasperi, where he just barely loses. I mean, this is important to understand, these very small things which allow the process to keep going. Something as big and as amorphous as charisma can't explain all those things. And that's why my own work and many others, and Elster I would say too, focus on these sort of processes, not necessarily always rational, but at least you can explain them in terms of how people see their interests. And so that's, I think, where we really do disagree. I have a whole bunch of little things that I think, I could talk about, but I think it'd be kind of maybe taking us aside. I do want to say, I think you're really off base on one case, on several, but Myanmar particularly, I just think you really get wrong. Because a standard, and it's partly because it's the earlier Bruce, you are looking at liberal revolution. But we can have revolutions where the outcome is not liberal. We shouldn't be teleological, right? Even if it looks like it's a democratic revolution, it may not be a liberal one. And so in your chapter on Myanmar, you focus on this key moment where Aung San Suu Kyi decided not to pursue the presidency. And I accuse you there, you say, why didn't she pursue the presidency and challenge the military and face them down? The reason is because she would end up back in jail, of course, or at least that's what she thought, and we have to trust her more than us. But also, of course, it doesn't matter what her formal role is. She is the paramount leader. There's no question about that. She has the support of the people. The key thing I think a lot of Westerners miss when looking at Myanmar is that we focus on the Rohingya, who are not part of the constitutional bargain. They're not considered part of the country. They're not considered citizens or nationals, and that's totally a widespread view. Every Burmese I've ever talked to has that belief, more or less. And so when you're talking about the polity, the treatment of those outside the polity is sort of neither here nor there and doesn't go to the constitutional bargain. Instead, what we have in Myanmar is a bargain between the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, and the military. And this is what it is. It's possibly stable as a kind of situation of cohabitation. It doesn't need to lead to a liberal outcome, even if it might lead to a constitutionalist one. That's, I guess, the point. So we might want to disentangle liberal revolution from constitutional revolution. I mean, your Iran case, I think, is helpful here. But I just think that particular one you get wrong. But again, I don't want to quibble. The big picture is it's a wonderful framework. Anyone who talks about Max Weber is okay in my book, and I'm just really impressed you managed to put it together in this way. I think probably some fusion, and this is actually how I see history. I do have a theory of history. History is susceptible to massive changes by charismatic individuals, right? They come along and they just change history. And they might be good and they might be bad, but they change history. Now, then the question is, once these charismatics arise and are accepted through some way or another, well, then we enter these routinized periods where you have to understand interests and assets and liabilities and bargaining. That's the normal state of the world. And that's the only thing we can get our hands on. Kudos to you for bringing in Weber, but I'm just not sure the framework works as broadly as you'd like it to.
Bruce, please, the floor is yours to respond to the first set of critiques.
Sure. Well, let me first talk in ways I think that respond to both of you at once, and then we could go into more particulars. So I am a Weberian, and in the notion, first, of the relative autonomy of the political legal from other spheres of economic and social life. Relative autonomy. Rather than being for example, a Marxist, which is a special case of there is a base characterized by, economic organization, or and then politics is a superstructure of that base. So today, we say, okay, how does the transformation of the technologies of communications, the internet. There are some people, and to my mind, incredible, who think it alone explains the crisis that we're in. That is a base superstructure thing. It is a factor. That's the relative autonomy, but not base and superstructure. Okay, so that's the first thing. But I'm more of a Weberian than that. I'm a Weberian of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Which is the birthplace of the modern idea of revolution. What are these Protestants doing? There is this structure of authority called the papacy. Top-down, revealed religion, inspired top-down, right? Luthers put something on the wall, and with his propositions, the printing press is crucial mode of technology here. If he had put these things on the wall 300 years before, nobody would have read them. But now they can. What is it? What is the basic notion here? It is that by being self-conscious of what the Bible really says, you can understand that the Pope is a fraud. This generated 150 years of war. Various truths which were self-evident if you only read the Bible, right? Would legitimate the state until 1648. What we have with the Enlightenment, we will take a detour around Spinoza, but Spinoza is not an intellectual figure as significant here. But what we have with the French Revolution is no, it is not the government, the state is legitimate not because it speaks for God in the correct way, but because it speaks for the people. Okay, now, and the way we could do that is to self-consciously understand the domains of freedom and self-government. Okay. Now, this notion that a mobilized movement on behalf of the people to gain control of the state. And here's another point. I am not a court-centered person. I am a regime-centered person. And then I try to fit the court in. And that's an opening salvo to the modes of accommodation with myself and Tom and Roberto, which actually, is extremely useful. But let's keep on the level of the regime right now. This mode of mobilized storming of the Bastille, and then assaulting, transforming the estates, the third estate, into the people. Obviously, can lead to total revolutions. This is a model of which, this model of the French Revolution leads to total revolutions, which leads on the one hand to Burkean conservative. This is not the way we Brits are going to do it. And to Lenin, Hitler. We are going to mobilize the people and against one or another form of oppression leads to totalitarianism. And one of my aims in this book, because of the Cold, is to liberate ourselves from the Cold War thought. Not that everyone had it, but it was, that really Lenin and Hitler and Mussolini and you name it, and others to be named, but it's not hard. That's really, they're really revolutionaries. Everybody else is namby-pamby. It's either to be sensible, evolutionary, or the abyss. Right? And what I'm trying to say is, no, there is, if we look at the world, counterexamples of revolutions on a human scale, in which rather than a mobilized movement trying to sweep away everything in one generation and build the great new society, however described. What we see is, and a central idea of mine is unconventional adaptation. Throwing out a lot, keeping a lot, using it to legitimate the new order. But to say that it is a new order, not just gradual. Okay, so that's the key thought here. Then we have, and here I go beyond both Weber and Ginsburg in this one important particular. I have this notion of organizational charisma. You see, I want to distinguish between what we call in 21st century language, charismatic personalities, and a symbolic centrality, which I will call charismatic, just to, because I always, my sin is to make up too many words, so I'm trying not to make up too many words. Symbolic centrality on the basis of sacrifice during time one. You look at a person like Nehru. He has no charisma, personal charisma. Boring. He is what he is, which is a well-trained barrister. So is Nelson Mandela, completely boring fella. I actually met him a couple of times. He's De Gaulle, he's using the mass media in a way that really is significant on the second go round, but in the first go round, and on the first go round too, when he's but all of these people make sacrifices. All the other generals, after all, made a deal with Pétain and collaborated with the Nazis. De Gaulle could have too. He had no reason in 1940 to think, everybody thought, that Hitler was going to win. When he runs out, you know, and gets into Great Britain, into London, and he calls upon the French to, you know, in the first 60 days, he gets 7,000 soldiers to come to Britain. 7,000. That's how many. Indeed, but I don't want to get too much into particular facts. Nelson Mandela, or well, let's go to the Italian case, because that would be particularly good. De Gasperi, you see. Who is De Gasperi? De Gasperi is the last democratic leader in opposition under Mussolini, and he is running out of the country to escape because he knows he's going to be thrown in jail. He's caught in the railroad station and thrown in jail for 18 months, where he almost dies, literally. Because he is a Christian Democrat, the Pope, for reasons of his own, gets him out. And when he signs a pact of collaboration, the Pope, that is, with Mussolini, what does De Gasperi do? He refuses to collaborate like all the other leading Catholics do. He refuses. During the period between 1930 and 1940x3, let's say, De Gasperi, for the first, you know, is a flunky librarian in the Vatican Library, meaning if I go to the Vatican Library and say, I'd like to have some books. Hey, boy, that's De Gasperi. Get them for me. De Gasperi's a great intellectual. This is complete humiliation. He is sacrificing, and he has no reason to think that that's his life. Okay, now, it isn't, so that's a different kind of, I don't know whether De Gasperi was charismatic. I doubt it. He doesn't, I don't think so. But you can tell me, Ruben. From what I've seen, he was more Nehru than anything. Now, what we have here, though, and let's get out of De Gasperi for the moment, just to emphasize this, but it isn't, and this is where I go beyond, it isn't only De Gasperi or the leaders. It is also, they manage for one institutional set of reasons or another to mobilize hundreds of millions of followers. And of course, the institutions of the old regime, and this goes back to Tom, and also the institutions of the old regime have a big impact on the ease and possibility of organizing a counter-mobilization, a revolutionary mobilization. When they win at time 2, there is this race, it isn't that, and this is where we disagree, insofar as we do. I agree that there is bargaining between the leaders of different revolutionary movements, if there are more than one, and with representatives of the old regime under one or another scenario. There is bargaining. However, the revolutionary leaders know that if they bargain away too much, their followers will say, you betrayed us. Now, what is it? And here is the crucial distinction between the past and the future. The followers of the mobilized followers have different ideological, they're all against the old regime for one or another reason they consider sufficient. They're the communists, for example, and the socialists and the Christian Democrats and the liberals are all against the regime, let's imagine. And they're all mobilized, right? But of course, their visions of the future are completely different. that unifies them is the wrongness of the existing situation, the illegitimacy of the existing situation. And that means that there is this central notion, which I think is the title of my responsive essay, never again. So when we look at Italy, for example, Roberto, the crucial features of never again are, never again shall we allow the Mussolini to arise. What does that mean? First of all, our constitution has to be rigid, because the flexible constitution of the king is the thing that got us here. Second of all, we cannot have over-centralization of power, because that's how Mussolini got it. Forget about whether it's right or not, but that's the things they had never again. Then of course, the communists, the socialists, and all these different mobilized groups have very different views of the future. You see, so at time two, this goes to the notion of insurance.
So Bruce, at this time too, there's a need for unity.
A constitution to express the never agains, so that if in a way that will minimize the betrayalists.
As you've been responding, Bruce,
Yes.
I think you've answered Roberto's question about your theory of history. One could say that you do have a theory of history, which is a great man theory.
No, it
of history.
Is a great man.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it. Well, it sounds like it.
This is not right. This is not right. There is nothing about Nehru that makes him a great man. There were a number of leaders. There are a number of leaders in South Africa of the movement. Mandela isn't the great man. Not at all. That just is a mischaracterization of time one. And they are struggling with one another. When Mandela comes out of prison, he is confronting an entire generation of leaders who he has no personal connection to. He has sacrificed in a great way, but so have the others who have left South Africa and set up the African National Congress in other countries, and then start militarily invading. This idea of a great man, no. There's a struggle amongst would leaders. In fact, okay, well, I don't want to get too much into the facts because we are running out of time.
Yeah, well, maybe we can get Roberto and Tom to give a couple of quick hits.
But just let me, so the crucial thing you see is for whoever comes out on top during time two, to satisfy the critical majority, a critical mass of revolutionaries, that when they're on top, now that they're on top, they won't do the same things that got the same disaster of the last time. It's this weight of the past which is not being sufficiently taken into account. Then they create these institutions, right? Which may or may not work the way they planned. So for example, it's very nice that they created a court in Italy, but the court almost didn't come into existence. Why? At the last minute, in his second term, does De Gasperi actually decide to create the court? There's also a provision that there should be a referendum. It isn't created until 1977. The mere fact that the Constitution said, now we start, the answer is because De Gasperi knows that his legitimacy, I mean, it's a struggle. And here we go to contingencies. You're absolutely right, Tom. Contingencies are very important. I'm Weberian in the ideal type. And then we have these contingencies which matter a lot. And he struggles a lot, and finally, at the last minute of the last day of his second term, he says, "Yes, there should be a court," and then it doesn't come into existence until he loses, and they have a time 3 legitimacy crisis. And
so we have these institutions created, and they can be adapted in these unconventional ways.
And then, of course, once we get these institutions in place, then we have Tom's and your incentives. And maybe and this goes to Roberto's point, the design, and that's why we're not really that far apart, except for the notion of a double charisma. And the problem of betrayal and the need to establish to your followers that we're not going to make the same mistakes that Mussolini made, and which, of course, are very different from the mistakes that the Fourth Republic made, etc. Okay. Please,
Roberto and Tom, do you want to make a short final point before we let Bruce close things for us? I know we're approaching about the hour time.
What about Tom first, because he might have to leave first, huh?
Tom, you're muted.
That's a great concession, Bruce, because that allows for a kind of synthetic approach where you see both some very deep contingent forces which sort of push this process forward. But then to understand its movement, one has to understand not just day-to-day interest in bargaining, but also, and this is what I study, mechanisms. What are the tools available for people in order to make the commitments, another Elster term, to each other to keep things moving forward? So, that kind of synthetic approach I can buy into. And so, I think that's all I'll say. I'll turn to Roberto.
No, I think that there are so many things to say, and we cannot. I'm still intrigued by the dynamic. I mean, what explains that in so different countries we have similar dynamics? That I think is difficult to explain, and I don't clearly understand. I get very well, and I like what you suggest both about betrayals and the never again. That because why? That integrates motivation. We don't want this to happen again. Now, I tend to be much more pessimistic and skeptic about the development of history. I don't know how history moves, but I know that it's moving in a direction I don't like. And here, just to integrate Tom recent studies with other people about democratic erosion, I think in the context of our very degraded democracies, for me it's difficult to see your picture integrated in this this period of democratic erosion. Why? The democratic erosion, again, says something about how leaders working for themselves, many times in collaboration with the top judges, establish certain privileges that they keep for themselves. And so I see in your history, if I see a problem in your description, this has to do, one, with this one single framework to examine so many different situations. But the other is about this, I wouldn't put in terms of the great man, but I would insist there is a problem in this kind of top-down approach. That I still see there in this top-down approach. You still have the court, you still have the leader, so these heroic figures, Harold Barak, or this president, the Gasperi, etc., the Gaulle. That's again, I think it's too much a top-down approach, and that
the
top-down and heroic.
The top-down is called the state. It is really important who controls the state. Now, what you are calling for, what my answer to you in the optimistic, and I'm not, I don't want to sound too optimistic, is that we need a new mobilized movement for liberal democracy. Rather than liberal Democrats looking upon any mass mobilization as populist and bad. What the problem in the United States right now is that there was a mobilized movement and for various structural, institutional things having to do with the primary system. See, because I'm always, all of these things are always being translated into the structure of the state because the state is relatively autonomous. We have chosen the weakest possible centrist candidate rather than the strongest possible candidate, calling for a revolution on a human scale on behalf of activist, liberal activist regulation. If that candidate had won, we would have been at time 2, and we would have seen whether that candidate could have gotten through new landmark statutes, new interventions, which would more effectively, eliminate, for example, the role of money in American politics, which is transforming American state into a plutocracy.
Can I interject? I think one of the really deep questions for Weber in general and the studies of charisma is why are certain times and spaces more amenable to charismatic appeal? And obviously we're at a moment in American history where you have Donald Trump, who's definitely a charismatic by any definition of the term, and maybe Bernie Sanders or someone like that, I don't know, people on the left. But the point is that those appeals, we are ripe for those kind of appeals. And many of your cases, it's easy to see why that was the case at the, after World War II, there's kind of this vacuum. It is a little puzzling why we are in this moment and why so many countries in the world are amenable to charismatic appeals, many of which, as Roberto suggested, are heading down the wrong direction and are anti-liberal and anti-democratic.
The crucial concept apparently there are several crucial concepts. A crucial one is the difference between lived experience of a generation and historical legacies. Time 4 is the historical legacies. And the lived experience of the United States, which has not given enough credit in the present moment of coronavirus, is endless war, which has really demoralized large zones of the American public. Do they know what they're doing in Washington, D.C.? Can't we ever get out of this? So that's one dimension here. Now, what is another dimension? See, when the world dramatically changes, post-1989, suddenly in Europe, all of the institutional systems presupposed the Cold War. NATO, for example, the European Union. Then suddenly we have these new challenges, and we haven't and the leaders of normal politics, because it's way after the 45s, and the most recent thing we had really is Franco Spain, weren't equal to the challenge. So sometimes there's a crisis, as in the U.S., with not being able to deal with this new reality of endless war in response to 9/11. But in Europe, in the West, in Europe, it's a different thing, that the world has changed and we haven't been creative enough in responding to it, leading to and then the Middle East is a function of the United States' interventions. Then India, that's an interesting question.
There's so much more to discuss, Bruce and Tom and Roberto. No, not at all, Bruce. We could continue for much longer. And in fact, what I will do is I'll propose that we convene another discussion at some point, because there's a lot more to talk about, especially with the American case. What I want to do now is, of course, thank each of you for taking part in this video interview discussion on Bruce's book, Revolutionary Constitutions. Really, Bruce, a revolutionary study that will enrich our understanding of
Like
modern
charismatic
constitutionalism.
leader with no followers.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, I
that's-
think you've got some followers. I will also highlight the chapters written by Tom and Roberto in a new book entitled
Yeah.
Revolutionary Constitutionalism, which gathers essays in response to Bruce's book. There it is. Tom is holding it up. Finally, I do want to say one more thing, which is to flag an award-winning book by Tom Ginsburg called How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, published just last year by University of Chicago Press. And I want to raise the curtain on a book to come in August, I believe, Roberto, is it correct? The Oxford Handbook of Constitutional Law in Latin America, co-edited by Roberto Gargarella, coming out, I think, in August 2020, published by Oxford University Press. Yeah, congratulations to the two of you. Congratulations to the two of you. And Bruce, congratulations to you on this wonderful book. We look forward to the future volumes and to
So
more
do I.
opportunities to discuss with you. Thank you to all.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
See you
Rich.
soon. Thank you.